Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to do a video reflecting on the last 4 videos because we're going to talk about RAID. Got him! Well, not that kind of RAID. The center panel. And here we used our advanced Google degree to type in the word RAID disk explain, because what I want are a bunch of pictures of what we can look at it. Because that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to remember which version it was that striped with parity, because I want to be able to make use of multiple disks and still be able to rebuild my data without too much trouble if one of the drive fails. It's not as much for me an issue of do I need to be super fast? No, I just would like to have a system that if I get notification that drive 3 or drive 4 died, that I could replace that one, be it an SSD or a serial ATA, that then I could then put it in there and it would we could rebuild it, and it would take some time. But again, I'd be back up to snuff without having lost anything. Now, when we look at the very first one, I guess we'll start with, is RAID 0, which is explained by this diagram, okay? And what it is it's striping. And there is no redundancy. Way I want to remind people, if you get confused, the 2 primary ones are 1 and 0. Remember, 0, RAID 0, gives you 0 protection for data loss. 0 protection for data loss. Okay? Is that easy to remember? 0 protection for data loss. It's striping. It's running some of the data between the 2 drives. In that second video of the 4 recent videos, the one all the way back, the third one back, where we had to initialize that SSD that we were going to use as a backup, as external backup, what did we do? We had to partition it. And partitioning was cutting one physical drive into multiple logical drives, multiple segments, multiple rooms. It's 3 rooms in the same trailer as it was. We're cutting it up and making it smaller. What the first RAIDs were doing were arraying their disks. So this is my knowledge. I'm not going to argue with Wikipedia, because Wikipedia now says that I stands for inexpensive disk. And the best of my knowledge, in the last 40 years, it has never been an expensive disk. It was always independent disk. And if you think about what life was like 40 years ago, it would make sense, because we were still using the big reel-to-reel tapes, and they were wide, and you would load up a tape, and that was the main memory, because the computers themselves were like a mainframe. They had what we called core memory. In fact, my father-in-law, God rest his soul, recently passed away. When he worked with computers, he called all random access memory core memory. And what core memory was, is it was a predecessor to, it was post-vacuum tubes and really transistor TTL logic static memory. It was a toroid wasn't this big, but it was a round toroid. You know what a toroid looks like? It's a donut. And we would run a horizontal line and a vertical line for sensing parallelizing, and then a charge line which was looped around the little toroid. And these took a bunch of those little rascals that were glued to a PC card. And the main memory for a mainframe computer or a mini computer may only have been, 4K. Everything else was disk or some other form of memory, tape memory, whatever. Well, the early disks were very big. You can probably see memes of these things on the internet. They looked like they were washing machines, like the top-loading washing machine, except instead of loading clothes in, it was like a spindle, much like the way a blender engages the little drink bucket that goes on top. It fed into a cartridge. Now, these were the first ones I was familiar with, and they were big platters. And they were so far apart, and it was like a stack of these things on a single spindle, just like we have inside a small drive of today. But they were big, and they were not in a vacuum. They were not in a clean air environment. They were huge. The read heads and all were huge, but the capacity was really slow. So the hardware itself was kind of slow reading to the individual disk drives. And the computers even back then were faster than the peripherals. So it was a way with a controller, with a hardware controller, it could stack different drives up, and it could then access more data in a bigger logical volume. We could assign it over multiple disks and multiple drives, and it could just be bigger. And so I think that's kind of where we look at this concept here now of RAID 0, which would be a good place to start, would be at the beginning with 0, right? And it's just data striped across, but there's no safety, there's no redundancy in this, right? We probably came back and put the word R here, RAID, before it was probably a array of independent disks before we made them redundant. Because now let's look at RAID 1. RAID 1 is disk mirroring. And that is a live, while you're working, copying over, making sure that disk B looks just like disk A, because that way if disk A fails, you got disk B. Or if disk B fails, you got disk A. We'll go back to RAID 0 that we were just at. What is the failure rate here? Is it lower or higher with RAID 0? Well, considering that you're striping across two different or multiple drives, you have minimum 2. But if you're striping across 2, if any one of them dies, you're out the whole kit and caboodle. With RAID 0, remember, there is 0 protection, 0 redundancy. It may be faster because you're overcoming very, very slow hardware. In fact, let me see here. Now, how many of you people are familiar with serial ATA? It's got this kind of a connection, right? We've got a serial connection and a power connection, controller connection. Well, we also have, here's another one. This one is IDE. See the connector on the bottom here, right there? And if I could, I may take a picture of this. This is late enough in the system where we used to have technologies before ATA, which was advanced technology. But Western Digital, if I'm not mistaken, came up with it. And it was all parallel, because at that time, the limitation of the electronics, the transistor logic, parallel was about as fast as you could go, and you could send all 8 bits in at once. Boom, you could get them in 16, whatever it may be, 8-bit, 16-bit. You could send them all in at once, and it was faster. We just had to synchronize. They couldn't be too slow, kind of like DIMMs are for memory. We have a window, or the eye that is set up between the different switch rates of the different branches, but it's parallel. Then we came up with serial because serial was faster. And this serial ATA is faster than the IDE or the ATA. Now this drive itself says that this is PATA, which tells me it's a late in the process IDE drive, because they call it Ultra ATA. And they also have the word P in front, because when ATA was first developed, there wasn't a serial version, so it was just ATA. And as we developed the serial version, we got it a little bit faster. So how slow were the old drives? Because this is where the striping effect may add to the volume. What if you were a big company and you had big files, right? And you just couldn't necessarily always run, you'd be running back and forth on the tape. Even a disk drive would work, but you could only get them so big. And the platters were, they were cake size. They looked about like a modern day Tupperware cake type of carrier. Well, that's what they're. Well, let's look over here on our left screen. We see that the first serial ATA here, SATA 1, was only 150 megabytes per second. How slow is that by today's standard? And then you go back in time even older than this, and it was way super slow. So striping them together was certainly faster than ringing up someone in a computer center and putting your request in 4 hours or 12 hours earlier or a day earlier, so that you can take the volume and schedule taking this disk pack off the shelf to put your data in there and swapping it out of the computer center with somebody else's disk pack, so that you had server time, you had computer time, mainframe time they used to call it. Not necessarily server time, but even in some places you get server time is scheduled the same way today. But look at this. At our very best, I can't go to this is a screenshot, but at the very best, the 3, which is where we are now, which is the 6 gigabits per second, or 600 megabytes. How slow is 600 megabytes when we think about, modern SATA drives? Like this was a Gen 4, this T500. right? How fast is this one? Well, this one is, I don't remember what it says. It's on up about 72, I think. Yeah, 7,400. So this one is 7,400. My little finger there, if the camera will focus, right? Now, the ones we used in our backup drive in the first two of the last four were SN77, 770s, and they were 5150, basically 5,000 on the transfer rate. How much faster is that than, this 600 megabytes? What did we get when we tested those? We maxed out at it when we were going back and forth. About the most we got out of it was 6. So we didn't really speed things up there. So depending on the speed of your drives, you may have some improved operation going RAID 0, but you have more risk. Now think about it. We'll use these two as an example. These two hard drives. Whatever risk of failure this hard drive has, it has it independent of this one, right? Independent of this one. Whatever one this one has still has its own likelihood of failure, independent of this one. What happens when we put them together? Have we not doubled the risk that one of the two will fail? Because it's now, the disk drive is a logical drive composed of two physical drives of some sort, and each one of them having their rate of failure. So now I have all of my data across the minimum, the two drives that we have over here on our screen here. If either one of these fails, I've lost it all, the whole kit and caboodle. So I'm not a big RAID 0 fan, because the difference in what speed you might get, I think we could probably take advantage of with the newer hardware back when this was a thing. I don't know that this is really a thing that we'd want to do, but you could do it if you want to. But there's no redundancy. It has, what did I tell you, 0 data protection and double the risk of failure. In my mind, double the risk, because either one of those dies, if either one of them dies, you lose it all. Now we go to the one, RAID 1 is disk mirroring. But now if you can imagine, this is going to be awfully slow, because now you've got twice as much stuff to do. Every time you write a block or a sector's worth of information out to a hard drive, it's still got to be made and copied over to this other hard drive as well. And then, we got to have obviously some kind of handshaking or something going on. So you're writing it twice. Maybe your CPU is sitting there twiddling its thumbs, but the disk controller has got to be controlling both of those drives. It's got to write as well as just read. Reading is generally faster than writing, because we have to erase it or initialize it as we go, or even if we erase it on the fly, we're still got to erase it. Versus reading, we just read, right? Right? Is that right? Now, what is next on our list of RAIDs that we might have? Well, I have this great invention called RAID 1+0. Most people just call it RAID 10. And what I think you'll find, I wonder if I can make that bigger. No, it doesn't want to let me do it without bringing up a big advert. So maybe we can see it right here. RAID 1.1+0 is a stripe and a mirror. And the first level is mirroring, which is what, I don't know if you'll be able to see. Let me make that as big as I can make it. So this is RAID 1, two sets of RAID 1s, which are striped disks, because what we're doing is we're striping it for speed, but then for safety, we're mirroring it. So what is the ratio of efficiency here? Before, with RAID 0, you get 0. You're using 100% of your drive, but it's two different pieces, and you're kind of double the risk of failure. We speed it up, we got double the risk of failure. Now with the mirroring, now we have 50% ratio. If you want 1 terabyte of storage, you have to buy 2 terabytes of storage, one for each drive, so that they can be mirrored over for your redundancy. So it's not very efficient. This is a little bit better, but the minimum number you can do this with is 4. So you got to have, at least, if you wanted to have the 2 terabytes of data, you needed 4 disk drives to do it and 4 places to land it, because you had 2 mirror sets. And so you only got to use half of it. So you still had to buy 4 terabytes for the 2 terabytes you could use. Now, what I was trying to remember as I build up this project is, what if I want to do some RAID? And I go back to my old days over 20 years ago, when we set up a server, we had set it up with RAID 5. I could remember what it's doing from 20 years ago. I just couldn't remember which one of the RAIDs it was. I'll just be honest with you. And what RAID 5 does is, if we'll look back at it, let's look at the big screen. It is striping, but it's got this other word here, parity. And that's a big important thing. Now, we could think about it, if we really wanted to, we could think about it as being like, we had all those stripes, plus we add this extra, this parity to it. The problem is it ends up getting walked around all of the drives because of how big the data is and its different sizes. And so when one stops one place, the other one will start and it'll go on and go on. But the green bit, the parity, is like an equation. Best way I can explain how that works, because I don't know that I know it all the way down to the chip level, but basically is, if I have only two things, A and B, and I know that they're equal, then A is B and B is A. All right, that would be like a mirror. Okay, if I stripe, I have half of the stuff on each one of them, and it's all just a sum. It's just, I don't know what A is, I don't know what B is, I just know what the total is. All right, so that doesn't help me that much. Now, what RAID 5 does is it takes at least 3 disks, because it stripes A and B, and it creates parity, which can be used to reconstruct either one of these if A or B is lost. Think about it like, if A and B equals X. Basic algebra. If I know X and I know A, then I can figure out what B is. If I know A and I have B, I can figure out what X is. If I have X and I have B, I can figure out what A is. So we can construct it, we can reconstruct it as long as we have just one of those things missing. Well, when we look at RAID 5, what it's doing is, the minimum would be 3, because we'd have the stripe pair and then a parity. But when we have 3 and still have just one thing we come up with. So we have A and B and C and X. And if any one of those is gone, A and B, we have X, we can tell what that one is. So that's not a problem whatsoever. So what happens is we can improve our efficiency. In the picture you just saw, all right, if we started with 2, we would need 3 drives. So to get 2 terabytes of data, we would need 3 terabytes of drive, because one's going to be parity, right? Well, what if we wanted, so that's only 1/3. Your overhead is only 1/3 of that. You're only wasting 1/3, not like the RAID 1 where we're mirroring it, where it's 1-to-1. It's half of it. Well, here it's going to be 1/3. What happens when we go to this picture that we see right here? Well, it's 1/4, right? We have it's equal to 1/3 of the volume, but it's 1/4 of the drives is parity, and so on and so on. So it scales. Now, the downside of this is it's a little bit faster than mirroring and a little bit slower than just plain striping, because now we have this extra bit of data that we have to transfer. That's going somewhere. It's got to be generated, and it's got to be written. It's got to be read when we bring it back to make sure that the data is complete. We didn't lose any blocks. But if we lose any one of these disk drives, we can, in theory, replace it. This is RAID 5. And now when we go over to our page that we had loaded up on the other screen, this was our 2 boards we were looking at in our most recent 2 videos. We see we have a picture set up, and we have down here potentially 5 drives down below here, right? And 1 above, 6 total drives. If you like this content, please go to calldeltocell.com, find the tab that says on YouTube, click it, and it'll open up a page of QR codes. There you can use a smartphone to scan and get to the YouTube page, or you can just mouse over and click it on a PC. There you'll be able to subscribe to this little button over here and click the notification bell so that YouTube will notify you. Thank you. And we have down here potentially 5 drives down below here, right? And 1 above, 6 total drives. Now, part of what made me interested in this one is because we don't have the heat sinks here. If I wanted to, I could partition my Gen 5 into different operating systems and just boot the right partition. We could do that. That's one way to do it. This is my fastest drive on this board. I'll probably want that for real work. But as far as saving up, if I were, a gamer or something like that, and I'm not really where I am the slowest thing in the system, not the not the game itself. I don't really need necessarily all the speed, but I might like a lot of volume. So I might leave this as a non-RAID or just a straight up drive and then use these others. But now here's the thing. This is only going to be, a stripe is only going to be as fast as its slowest component. So whatever drive is the slowest, that's going to set the throughput for that array. That makes sense, right? You buy that, right? So here I have this one. As I prepared in advance, this is running off of the chipset. It's still Gen 4, but it's running off the chipset. Running off of the CPU like this one is instead of the chipset. So now the processor can write to these, in theory, probably a little bit more efficiently than it could write to turn over to the chipset and let it negotiate all this stuff out here. So these may not be the fastest. I may not need the fastest. If I can speed up the effect by striping, that's great. If I can use parity to make sure that I have redundancy and I have them safe, all my data is safe, that's good as well, right? So we're in great shape. These run off the CPU, these run off independent. But what if there's a speed difference? Whichever one is the slowest side is going to limit everything. But now look at this one. I don't have heat sinks here and here. If I were to use these four right here, and this was to get hot, or that one was to get hot, we're going to slow down the entire disk, logical disk. If I'm running this one and this one together, and these are in cahoots, then I'm running across hardware, and whatever that slowest path, in that process is going to slow them down. It would matter on this side as well. So what then happens with this is, we looked at the manual and we learned that if we were to pull this one out, we can't necessarily, to my knowledge, be able to pull out one disk out of an array other than a failure. If we can pull one out of an array, and replace it, that's great if it's a redundant, like a 5, RAID 5. But if I'm doing hardware and I actually lose this one drive, my array is running crippled. I don't have a place to replace it with. If I put something in this slot, this ruins it. What I could do is to avoid going across chipset and CPU, is avoid this one, and to avoid, if I ever wanted to put something in here, avoid using this one, then that leads me to the minimum number of drives that I would need to do a RAID 5. The minimum it needs is 2 drives like these two and a parity. 2 drives and a parity. If I go back over to that screen, I would have 2 drives and a parity. So I'd have 2, 4, and 5. Is that no? 2, 3, 5, and 6 would be the drives that I would have left over, if that makes sense to you. But this particular subject isn't just about RAID and the 4 big ones that people might know about. 0, well, remember, what did I say about 0? 0 gives you 0 data protection, is there to try to make things faster. But are we living in, 128 megabytes per second or whatever, SATA 1 was, or below that? Are we living in those days where we really need a stripe disk for speed? I don't know. What was RAID 1? RAID 1 was the mirroring, and that's what you get out of it. You only get one size out of it. One side, 2 terabytes for 1 terabyte. It's just mirroring, and it tends to be slower than the other. And then we had 5, which is my favorite, from memory, because I'm not learning anything from 20 years ago. We striped for speed and capacity, but still had a parity out there, so we had redundancy. We could actually rebuild that. We've now seen how that works in the SSDs. We talked in the last 2 videos on the website, on ASRock's website. We verified that the NVMe, the M.2 slots, would do RAID, these forms of RAID that we're looking at, as well as the SATA. Now, look from one of the manuals. Here I have something highlighted. Remember, these were the conditions. This was a different board. This was the Carrera, one of the Carreras. I don't remember. Yeah, 790. This is the old Carrera. We're using 12, 13, 14th generation. Look what happened, though. If we populated that third PCIe slot, we lost SATA, SATA 0 through 3. That's not all of our SATAs, unfortunately, or fortunately. When we look at the actual board, this house of a board actually has 8 SATA ports. So we would lose half of it if we plug in. It's the same thing we had really over here with this one right here, right above that second PCIe or that second PCIe, we put a chip in here, this goes away. Well, it's kind of the same thing. Or we put a board here, this one goes away. They're one or the other. You can't have both. Over here on the main page, you see, we would do the same thing. 8 SATA. This, if we plug something in here, we lose half of these. And we go back to that manual and we configure that. If PCIe 3 is occupied, SATA 0 through 3, first 4 will be disabled. But think about that. Some of these enterprise drives may go 20 to 50 terabytes. And we could do a RAID 5 with them according to the documentation. So we could have 4, which would give us 3, which if we had, say, 25 terabyte spinny disk, Western Digital spinny disks, 2.5 slide in the back of our little case. We have 4 of them. That would give us 75 worth of data with the one going to parity. And of course, they would scatter across both of them. The problem I would have is if I lost that, I don't have anything I could put 75 terabytes of data on. You know, I mean, it's a good way to keep up with a large amount of data, but I have no way of keeping up with that much. So that's out. But I just want to point out that when we looked at the manual, or website, shall I say, when we looked at our 2 potential boards, we see that they do RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 5, RAID 1 plus 0, or RAID 10. These are all the big ones. There's another one, there's a 6, and there's a 7 that I don't see. And they're not relevant to us because we can't use them, so I don't know that I really need to worry about knowing that. But you notice that it says, we've already talked about it working on the NVMEs, but they also work with the serial ATAs on both cases. So what that allows us to do is maybe we can make use with the same main board. We can build a heck of a RAID out there. Even in our Lian Li Evo XL box that I've got up there, it will take in the plugins, it will take 4 big serials in there. Western Digital makes them maybe toward 30, 50 terabyte spinny disk will fit that machine. That's great. It'll be loud. It'll be louder than the NVMEs, but we could do that. If we chose a different board like the old Carrera, we would actually be able to go as much as 8 of those drives, assuming that Windows can support them. It's a software thing. Assuming Windows can support them, hey, we could have one heck of a server right then and there just running that one chage Carrera Z790 main board. We could do it if we really were hurting that bad for space. We could probably do it. The one thing we wouldn't be able to do is use that third PCIe, because as soon as we plug something in that board, the first 4 of those SATA ports or serial ATAs are going away. They're not going to work. So that's the first 2 videos of this kind of before this were all about that. You know, think about it. If you were trying to do something like this, you wouldn't really be able to RAID off of a main board that only had 2 NVMEs, unless you're just doing a mirror, which would be better than nothing, but it's going to cut your performance. When we start looking at a board like these 2 that are kind of mid-tier, these 2, the Nova and the Taichi Lite, what they're good for is I do have some options. I could also use that NVMe that comes off of the CPU. If I didn't want to put that in the RAID, I can put a separate operating system just on that stick and put it in that position and boot off the different drives instead of different partitions. So we have flexibility with either one of these 2. That's the point. But are you seeing, is this helping any? I'd hate to waste an hour and a half of your life and not give you anything for it. Is this helping you knowing, do you really need extra drives? If you did have extra drives, consider you can buy 4 terabyte, in some cases 8 terabyte NVMEs. Do you really need them? And if you did, what would they be used for? I hope this helps. All right. I'm tired of talking. I'm sure you're tired of listening. Let's close it out.